Hello, this is Steve Smith here, and it's another one of my CPD presentations, and this one is number 26, and it's called Information Gap Tasks. Let me give you some background first on the idea of the information gap task. It really came to the fore in the late 1970s into the 1980s, and it comes from, I think, really one major tradition, which is the communicative language teaching, CLT tradition. Where the idea is that second language learning is thought to best happen when students are focused on communicating, not talking about the language or focusing on the grammatical form. So communication being at the heart of language teaching. And in the world of English as a foreign language, bear in mind that in many classes there are students of different origins in the group, and that imposes a target language style teaching approach rather than a bilingual or translation-based approach. And so therefore communicative tasks made sense, particularly in that context. So I think that was the main influence from the world of EFL. At the same time, we've got to bear in mind that around that time as well, the work of Stephen Krashen and others was also influential, and the idea here being that natural language acquisition, if you like, we learn a second language in the same way we learn a first language, and therefore the key to that is just using comprehensible input and communicating. And Krashen came up with a very memorable quotation, which I've picked out there for you. We teach language best when we use it for what it was designed for, communication. So generally speaking, that's the background to the idea of the need to communicate, and I'm going to show you now how the information gap fits in with that need. So the principle of the information gap is that there needs to be a requirement to communicate. Students will want to use the language if there's an actual need to use it. And to achieve that, then you can create a gap in information. So where some students have some information, other students have different information. And between them, those students have to collaborate to complete a picture or solve a particular problem. And that need to communicate should add an extra level of engagement and motivation for students. In contrast to that idea of communicating through need to communicate, we have, if you like, the more traditional view that language lessons are really about manipulating language. For example, using traditional question-answer techniques such as display questions. Where is the book? It's on the table. What time did Jennifer go to the museum? She went at 10 o'clock. Those sort of traditional exercises, including drills, gap fill, and many more such exercises, are, if you like, playing with language, but they're not real communication. That was the major attack that was made on some of the methods that were being used in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. And along comes communicative language teaching, which says, let's freshen things up. Let's actually get students talking about stuff, communicating. Simple examples of communication gaps, even with near beginners, then here's some simple ones for you. Let's say student A writes down 4 things that they did last weekend, and student B has to simply use yes/no questions to guess what those 4 things were. That would revise the past tense, perfect tense, or preterite tense if you like, and provide many repetitions of simple verb forms. The second one there, the silent customer game, that's one where one student has a list of items on a shopping list, let's say a wedding list for a department store. They go into the store, but they do not have the gift of speech, so they have to use gesture or mime, while partner B, who is the shop assistant, has to guess what those items were. So again, there's a need to communicate. It's a good, fun activity, although it really kind of works at the simple level of vocabulary. Similar idea is the next case there, where each partner has a list of 10 items they're going to buy at the supermarket, and their partner has to guess the other person's list. Very, very simple ones that we can use with beginners. And the last example there is similar to the first, but this time each partner lists 10 things they're going to do during their next holiday, and partners use yes/no questions to work out what's on the other person's list. That would be good for the future tense, or immediate future tense, shall we say. So some nice simple examples there based on the information gap principle. Now, slightly more sophisticated example next, and this one is, again, a fairly typical one here, but what we have in front of you here is on the left a series of days, and here's some time slots, and this is someone's diary. It's what they did last week. So, for example, on Monday morning, they went shopping in town, then they read a book in the afternoon, went out to the cinema, and so on. Lots of examples of past tenses going on here. So, partner A has this list in front of them. Partner B has this list, which again has the days, the time slots, but this time a completely different set of activities. And all they've got to do, by the way, these could be in English or they could be in the target language. If you use them in English, by the way, that's more demanding because students then have to retrieve the vocabulary from memory as they translate, whereas if you put them in the target language, of course, much of the language is there already. So between them, the students simply ask each other, for example, what did you do last Monday morning? What did you do last Tuesday afternoon? And so on and so on. And then each partner writes down in an empty grid what their partner did. And then that information can be used for further classroom activities. For example, the teacher could ask students what their partners did in the third person. So that's a very straightforward sort of information gap task, but again, one which generates lots of repetitions. Now, you're probably familiar with the game of battleships, and just to remind you here, down the left we have a series in French of personal pronouns, I, you, he, she, we, and so on. Along the top here, we've got sets of chunks with verbs in the infinitive: go to a party at Mark's house, play tennis at the club, go to a concert in town, and so on. And as the students play the guessing game, trying to find where their partner's ships are, they have to keep reusing all these chunks. Now, there's clearly a gap in information here because each partner has their ships in different positions. But what we've got here is a very controlled example of the information gap principle, where, again, we're generating lots of repetitions of verb chunks. By the way, just to mention that very often these grids are used to practice verb conjugation. So you might have je suis allé, j'ai joué, je suis allé again, and so on, j'ai fait. I've added a bit extra here because I think just adding more to the verb produces something a little bit more communicative and engages the students in using chunks, not just verbs on their own. That's more efficient in terms of how we use our working memories, of course, and if students happen to remember the chunk, I went to a party, and they repeat it over and over again, perhaps they're more likely to be able to bring out that chunk in the future rather than have to construct it from the separate bits of I went and the vocabulary party and so on. That's a whole other matter, and we talked about that in the previous CPD session number 25 about sentence builder frames. Here's another example similar to the first, but more demanding. Person A has got personal information about three people here: Sophie, Lionel, and Jean-Paul. The notes here are in English. They could be in the target language. And we have information about their home, their family, job, pastimes, and movies. And person B has a different grid with two other people, and between them they've got to simply ask each other questions and complete the gaps in their grids. This is more demanding than the first task I showed you because they need some more sophisticated question forms to use. So they will have to ask questions like, where do they live? Tell me about their family. What do they do for a living? What are their favourite hobbies? So it's more sophisticated in terms of the use of questions and the variety of structures being used here. So this is the sort of task you probably wouldn't tackle until your students had done a minimum of, let's say, 3 or maybe even 4 years of the language. Again, with all of these tasks, they can be scaffolded. For example, in this one, if you thought that the question forms were problematical for your students, you could write them up on the board. And then maybe 5 minutes into the task, you could gradually erase those from display so that students have to start using their memories more. Again, once the students have worked in pairs on that, you can then use the information that they found out to do other tasks. Ask the Experts is a very specific one which I wanted to describe to you, perhaps best used with advanced students, but also intermediates as well. Let me explain it to you here. 4 students in your class, these are the experts, each have a short text, probably an informational text. Each of those 4 texts are different, but they're all on the same theme. So that theme might be, let's say, Paris, information about Paris. The rest of the class all have a set of, say, 10 or a dozen questions. They can only get the answers to those questions by going to speak to the 4 different experts. They can't get all the answers to their questions by speaking to one expert. So it's a sort of a jigsaw activity. They've got to go and speak to the different people, take notes from those people, combine the notes then so that they then have a set of information about the topic area. Now, the mechanics of this can vary. The notes could be taken in the target language, the notes could be taken in English. There are issues to manage in the classroom about spacing the students around and the fact that you'll get potentially groups of students around one expert. That's fine because the expert can talk and all the students can take notes. So I think this is particularly good, I would say, for advanced students where you've got quite hard informational texts which are difficult to exploit in a very communicative way, and often we get texts like this in A-level, and where you can create an information gap, a communicative task, to make the, if you like, the acquiring of the information more fun. So that's Ask the Experts. It's actually based on an idea from the book by Nation and Newton, the name of which I've forgotten at the moment, but they call it Ask and Move. And one more example here of a simple information gap principle. You don't need to read all this text, by the way. The principle here is that each partner has a text. The 2 texts are similar, but they have differences. So in this text, for example, based on the idea of my holiday, partner A has, during the summer holidays, I went to France for a fortnight. I went with my parents and my brother. We took the car and the ferry, and so on. Person B might have something like this. During the summer holidays, I went to Spain for a week. I went with my mother and my brother and my sister. So there'll be differences. The number of differences can depend. With perhaps more sophisticated classes, you'd put more differences in. But the idea is simply that they read to each other the texts and then make notes about where things are the same and where they are different, and then the partners can compare notes at the end. Clearly, to do this sort of task, students need to be good readers. They need to have good phonics skills. And with all of these information tasks, I'm going to say this again in a second actually, but students need to be prepared. They need to have the language and the skills to do them. It would be a mistake to let students loose on an information gap task if they don't have the linguistic means to do it successfully. So, generally speaking, what are the advantages then for these information gap tasks? Well, they are usually engaging. They're enjoyable. There's a motivation involved. They do allow for bags of repetition, recycling, and retrieval of language, and we know how important retrieval practice is for long-term memory. They can work at various levels. They can be used with near beginners, probably more often with your intermediate and maybe advanced students as well, but they can be used and adapted for all sorts of levels. Very importantly, we shouldn't underestimate this point, they break up the style of the lesson. So if you're a predominantly teacher-centered teacher, but feel you want to break things up, it's often good to do one task and then link it to an information gap task which gets students working in pairs or small groups. So let's say 10 minutes of teacher-led, 10 minutes of pair work. By the way, I'd say that pair work generally better than group work here for the simple mathematical reason that with 2 students they're going to get more speaking in than they would with, say, a group of 4. And of course, group work can be harder to manage, and with group work you get the issue of the kind of lazy member who lets the others do the work. So that's an issue with group work. So generally speaking, I would certainly advocate pair work ahead of group work on the whole. You've also seen how easy they are to design these information gaps. They're often quite low preparation. And once you've got your materials to reuse, you can use them many times. And once an information gap task is underway, your job is often really just to sit back and observe and listen, intervening now and again where help might be needed. But it's a good example for you to do some assessment for learning, to go around, have a listen, do minor correction where needed, and just have a listen to what your students can do. It's very, very informative for you. But as with almost everything we do in the classroom, there are pros and cons, and there are issues to do with information gap tasks. And this key one, which I alluded to before, is the fact that students, they need to have the language for the task. So very often, info gaps are better for practicing existing known language, not for teaching new language. I'm not sure that's a hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, if you think of the model of PPP, presentation, practice, production, the information gap task is likely to come later in that sequence. Although some can involve very controlled practice of language, some less so, generally speaking, it's at that stage where the students have had lots of input to process, lots of controlled practice, and they're at the point where they can begin to use the language a bit more for themselves. Much depends on the task. There are issues of class control. As soon as you do any pair work task or group work task, students need to stay in the target language, and therefore that's a key thing to bear in mind, particularly if you're a new teacher and establishing your routines and your relationships. And one other criticism that's levelled at these tasks is the extent to which these are real communication at all. And there are teachers, particularly I think coming from the tradition of task-based language learning, who would say that many of these information gap tasks are really ultimately still just playing with language. So if we took the example of one earlier, talking about each other's diaries, really that's a reading aloud task. It's not genuine communication. It's not really students wanting to talk about what they want to talk about. And, for example, Bill Van Patten, who writes about this sort of thing, has suggested that information gap tasks are not really tasks, they're kind of activities that are still about manipulating language. Personally, to me, in the school context of teaching modern languages, that to me is not an issue at all, where I think the classroom is a place for learning and where actually playing with language is an important part of the language learning process. Even so, there is more motivation in information gap tasks than there might be in the traditional drill type or comprehension exercise. So I've tried to cover a range of issues there to do with information gap tasks, and I hope you found that useful. As always, you find lots more information about these sorts of issues in these 3 books, which I'm going to plug shamelessly to you: the Language Teacher Toolkit from 2016, Breaking the Sound Barrier from 2019, and my book from 2017, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher. So thanks once again for listening, and do subscribe to the channel, that would be great, and have a look through the other screencasts, and there should be some more to come. Bye.